I run a YouTube channel about urban exploration, but lately, it's been hanging by a thread. My subscriber count is tanking, views are down, and the algorithm has forgotten I exist. I've done all the usual stuff, abandoned factories, creepy old houses, underground tunnels, but it's all starting to feel the same. I need something big, something that'll make people stop scrolling and click. That's when I hear about Hollow Hills Asylum. The asylum's been sitting abandoned on the outskirts of a small Pennsylvania town for decades. It's one of those places everyone knows about but no one talks about. From the outside, it's just a crumbling old building with smashed windows and vines crawling up the walls. But the stories? They're the kind that grab you by the throat. Patients who went missing, experiments gone wrong, doctors who dabbled in things they shouldn't have. Locals say you can still hear screams at night, see shadows moving when there's no one there. It's the kind of place that's perfect for my channel. If I can catch even a glimpse of what's rumored to happen inside, I'll have the kind of content that'll put me back on the map. So, I pack up my gear, cameras, extra batteries, flashlight, and a crowbar just in case, and make the drive. I get there late afternoon, just as the sun's starting to dip behind the hills. The asylum looks even worse up close, like it's sinking into the ground, trying to disappear. The walls are covered in graffiti, some of it normal teenage crap, but some of it's weird. Symbols that don't make sense, drawings of faces that look twisted and wrong. The air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on my chest, and there's this smell, mold, rot, and something else I can't quite place. It's like the whole building is rotting from the inside out. I take a deep breath and start recording. Alright, guys, today we're exploring one of the most infamous abandoned places in the country, Hollow Hills Asylum. There are no official records of what really went down here, but the rumors are enough to keep people away. Experiments, disappearances, ghosts, whatever you believe, this place has a dark history. And tonight, we're going to uncover it. I push open the front gate, which creaks like it hasn't been moved in years, and make my way to the entrance. The doors are long gone, just splintered wood and broken glass. As I step inside, the temperature drops immediately, like walking into a freezer. The sun is still setting, casting long shadows that stretch and twist, making the whole place feel like it's alive. I flick on my flashlight and sweep it across the lobby. The floor is covered in debris, chunks of plaster, shattered tiles, and piles of old, yellowed papers. Rusted wheelchairs and hospital beds are scattered around, some of them tipped over, others standing like they were just left there in a hurry. I get this overwhelming feeling that I'm not supposed to be here, like the building itself is trying to push me out. I ignore it and keep moving. The sound of my footsteps echoes through the empty halls, bouncing off walls covered in peeling paint and flickering graffiti. Every now and then, I catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn, there's nothing there. Just shadows playing tricks. At least, that's what I tell myself. I head deeper into the asylum, passing old examination rooms and offices that look like they've been ransacked. I find patient records scattered on the floor, some of them still legible. The names are faded, but the notes are still there, scribbled diagnoses, lists of medications, progress reports that all seem to end abruptly. It's like one day everyone just stopped. There are signs of panic everywhere. Chairs flipped over, papers strewn about, and in one room, an old gurney with leather straps still attached, stained dark brown from God knows what. My camera captures it all, and I narrate as I go, describing every eerie detail for my viewers. But the deeper I get, the more I start to feel it, that creeping sense that I'm not alone. I decide to check out the upper floors, climbing a staircase that groans under my weight. The handrails are rusted, and every step kicks up dust that stings my throat. I reach the second floor, and it's like stepping into another world. The rooms are darker here, colder. My flashlight flickers, and for a split second, I think I see a figure at the end of the hall. It's just a shadow, gone as quickly as it appeared, but it leaves my heart racing. I force myself to keep moving, but every door I pass feels like it's watching me. I can't shake the feeling that something's just around the corner, waiting. I make my way into what looks like an old rec room. There are broken chairs, a moldy pool table, and a piano that's missing half its keys. On the walls are faded murals, paintings of smiling patients, doctors in white coats, all of it smeared and discolored over time. But what stands out the most is the mirror on the far wall. It's cracked and covered in grime, but as I approach, I see something move behind me. I whip around, but there's nothing there. Just the empty room and the distant hum of the wind outside. When I look back at the mirror, though, I see it, a dark shape, standing right where I was just a second ago, too tall and thin to be human. My breath catches in my throat. I slowly back away, refusing to take my eyes off the mirror. The figure stays, motionless, its features blurred like it's not quite real. I try to film it, but my camera glitches, the screen filled with static. I'm shaking now, my heart pounding so loud I can barely hear anything else. I bolt out of the room, tripping over debris as I go, and slam the door behind me. My chest is tight, panic clawing at my insides, but I force myself to keep going. I need to get more footage. I need proof that I was here, that what I saw was real. I push deeper into the asylum, past more empty rooms and dark hallways. The walls seem to close in, and the air gets heavier with every step. I can hear faint sounds now, whispers, like someone's talking just out of earshot. It's not clear, more like a low murmur that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I try to ignore it, blaming it on the wind or old pipes, but deep down, I know that's not it. There's something here with me, something that's been waiting in the dark. As I round a corner, I find myself standing in front of a large set of double doors, the kind you'd see in an operating room. They're slightly ajar, and there's a faint light flickering from inside. I push them open and step into what used to be a surgical theater. The room is massive, with a domed ceiling and rows of seats where doctors would watch procedures. The operating table is still there, rusted and stained, with ancient surgical tools scattered around. But what really grabs my attention is the writing on the walls, words scrawled in a language I don't recognize, mixed with symbols that look ancient, almost occult. I walk closer, my camera capturing every disturbing detail. There's a chill in the air, colder than anywhere else in the building, and my breath fogs in front of me. As I move toward the center of the room, my flashlight flickers again, and I hear it, a low, rhythmic banging, like something is being hit repeatedly. It's coming from somewhere below, and every thud sends a shiver down my spine. I look around, trying to figure out where it's coming from, but the sound is everywhere, reverberating through the walls and floor. I try to film the noise, but the camera glitches again, the screen warping and distorting. I can't see anything, just static and flashes of dark shapes. The banging gets louder, more frantic, and it feels like the whole room is shaking. I know I should leave, that whatever's causing this isn't something I want to meet, but my legs feel rooted to the spot. I'm trapped between the need to document everything and the instinct screaming at me to get out. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stops. Silence fills the room, thick and oppressive. I take a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but before I can make a move, the lights go out completely. I'm plunged into darkness, the kind that's so complete it feels like it's swallowing me whole. I fumble with my flashlight, but it's dead. My camera screen is black. I'm alone, standing in the pitch-black heart of a place that feels more alive than anything I've ever felt before. My pulse is racing, my mind spinning with fear and adrenaline. I need to get out, but in the dark, I can't tell which way I came from. Every direction looks the same, just endless, shadowy nothingness. I try to keep calm, to focus, but the whispers start up again, louder now, and this time, I swear they're calling my name. Before I even set foot in Hollow Hills Asylum, I'd stopped in the nearest town, a place called Eldridge. It's the kind of town that feels like it's stuck in time, small, rundown, with just a couple of streets and buildings that look like they haven't seen a coat of paint in decades. I figured I'd get some local color for my vlog, maybe even find someone who could tell me more about the asylum's history. But the second I walked into the only diner on Main Street, I knew something was off. The place was dimly lit, with old wood-paneled walls and a smell like burnt coffee and grease. A handful of locals sat scattered around, hunched over plates of food that looked as tired as they did. They gave me side eye as soon as I walked in, like they knew I didn't belong. I sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and pulled out my camera to get some B-roll of the town. The waitress, an older woman with deep lines etched into her face, came over to take my order. She had this weary look in her eyes, like she'd seen it all and didn't care to see any more. When I asked her about Hollow Hills, she just stopped, her expression tightening like I'd said something dirty. She told me they don't talk about that place, that it was better left forgotten. When I pressed, she gave me a hard look and said, "People who go up there don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all." I could hear a few mutters from the booths behind me, murmurs of "stupid kid" and "ain't gonna listen," but I brushed it off. I was used to this kind of thing. Every time I went to a new spot, the locals always tried to scare me off with ghost stories and urban legends. It was all part of the game. I thanked her for the warning and left a tip before heading out, but I could feel the weight of their stares on my back as I walked out the door. Across the street was a small bait and tackle shop, the kind of place that had probably been there since the town was founded. I decided to check it out, thinking maybe someone inside would have more to say about the asylum. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped in, and the musty smell of old wood and fishing gear hit me instantly. The shelves were packed with dusty lures, fishing rods, and faded postcards of local landmarks that were probably long gone. Behind the counter was an old man, maybe in his 70s, with a grizzled beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He glanced up from a newspaper as I walked in, sizing me up in a way that made my skin crawl. I gave him a nod and started browsing, pretending to be interested in the junk on the shelves. After a few minutes, I brought up the asylum, asking if he knew anything about it. The old man put down his paper and stared at me with eyes that were way too sharp for his age. "Hollow Hills, huh? You don't want to go there, son," he said, his voice raspy like gravel. "Please don't just get forgotten by accident. There's a reason it's empty." I played it cool, asking him what kind of reason he meant. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "That place, it's got a way of keeping folks. It don't just lose them. It takes them." Doctors were into things they shouldn't have been, trying to fix people in ways that didn't make sense. Heard they were doing things with electricity, with chemicals, with stuff that messed with the mind. People heard screaming coming from there, even long after it shut down. And those who went looking, they heard it too. I could tell he was trying to scare me, but it was good content, so I kept the camera rolling. I asked if he'd ever been up there himself, and he gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "I ain't stupid enough to go poking around a place like that. But I've seen folks go. Young ones, like you, thinking they're gonna catch something on camera or whatever it is you kids do. None of them ever look the same when they come back. Eyes all glassy, like something's been taken from them. And some just don't come back at all." There was a beat of silence, and then he reached under the counter and pulled out a small flask, taking a long swig before continuing. "You think this is some ghost story, kid? You think you're gonna catch a couple of shadows and put it on the internet? The stuff in there, it ain't dead. It's just waiting. And once you see it, it sees you too." He gave me this look that sent a shiver down my spine, but I just nodded, thanked him for the advice, and left the shop. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake what he'd said. I'd heard plenty of warnings before, but there was something in the way he spoke, like he knew more than he was letting on. But I was already committed. I had driven hours out of my way to get here, and there was no way I was going back empty-handed. I hopped in my car and headed toward the asylum, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to get darker with every mile. The trees towered overhead, blocking out the setting sun and casting long shadows across the pavement. I cranked up the radio, trying to drown out the growing unease, but all I could pick up was static. It was like the town and the asylum were cut off from the rest of the world, locked in their own little pocket of time. The closer I got, the worse the road became, potholes and cracks making it nearly impossible to drive. The car's headlights barely caught through the gloom, and I started to feel like I was driving into the mouth of something alive. By the time I pulled up to the gates of Hollow Hills, it was almost dark. I grabbed my gear and got out, staring up at the asylum's looming facade. The old man's words echoed in my head, but I pushed them aside. I was here for the footage, for the views, and for my shot at getting my channel back on track. I turned on my camera and started recording, walking up to the main entrance with the kind of confidence I'd forced myself to wear. I did my usual spiel, explaining where I was and what I hoped to find, but even as I spoke, I felt the weight of the building pressing down on me. The doors were busted, hanging off their hinges, and the inside was pitch black. I shined my flashlight into the lobby, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. It was like the place was eating the light, swallowing it whole. As I stepped inside, I felt the temperature drop again, even colder than before. The air was thick, heavy, and filled with a faint, sour odor that made my stomach churn. I started exploring, narrating every step, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept hearing faint noises, footsteps that didn't belong to me, distant whispers that made no sense, and a low, rhythmic tapping that seemed to follow me from room to room. The further I went, the stranger things got. The shadows seemed to shift on their own, stretching across the walls like they were alive. My flashlight flickered, and every time it did, I thought I saw movement just out of sight. I kept brushing it off as my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I found an old office, the door half-rotted and hanging off its hinges. Inside were scattered files, broken furniture, and a moldy carpet that squished under my feet. I picked up a patient record, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. The name was smudged, but the details were legible: paranoid delusions, unresponsive to treatment, and the phrase subject shows signs of extreme agitation. I flipped through more records, all filled with similar notes. It was like every patient here had been trapped in their own personal hell, and the doctors had been no help at all. I moved on, trying to keep my nerves in check, but every room felt worse than the last. The walls seemed to lean in, the ceiling hanging lower, like the whole place was slowly closing around me. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, echoing through the empty halls. My flashlight caught something on the floor, a long, dark stain that trailed off into the shadows. Blood? Rust? I couldn't tell, and I wasn't about to find out. I just kept moving, feeling the asylum's pull growing stronger with every step. I finally made it to the second floor, my flashlight barely holding on. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with doors that seemed to go on forever. I turned to my camera, my voice shaking as I explained where I was. I wanted to sound brave, to keep up the facade, but I knew my fear was leaking through. The whispers were back, louder now, almost like voices right next to me. I swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing, just the empty corridor and the faint sound of dripping water. I pushed open a door at the end of the hall, stepping into what looked like a patient's room. The walls were covered in scrawled messages, scratched deep into the plaster. Words like help, trapped, and... I don't even know how long I spent wandering the second floor, every hallway bleeding into the next, each door I opened leading to a room that looked exactly like the one before. It was as if the asylum was some kind of twisted maze, each step dragging me further into its grip. I kept telling myself it was just the layout, that the building was old and falling apart, but the whispers never stopped. They were faint at first, like a distant radio signal, just below the range of my hearing. But they were getting louder, closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to tell me something. My flashlight was flickering more now, and the dim, stuttering beam only made things worse. Every time it blinked out, I saw shapes moving in the dark, darting just out of sight. I tried not to look directly, but my eyes were drawn to them, shadows that seemed too solid, too purposeful. It felt like I was surrounded, like the asylum's walls were filled with things that were just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I finally reached the end of the hallway and pushed open a heavy wooden door that led into a stairwell. The smell hit me first, sharp and sour, like mold and something rotting. I hesitated, shining my light down the steps, but they just descended into a thick, impenetrable darkness that made my skin crawl. I almost turned back, but then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a faint, barely visible chalk outline on the wall, almost like a symbol or letter. I couldn't quite make it out, but it looked old, older than the asylum itself, like it had been scratched there before the place even existed. I started down the steps slowly, my heart hammering in my chest with each creak of the wood beneath my boots. The air was thick, damp, and filled with a strange metallic taste that clung to the back of my throat. The flashlight beam bounced erratically, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to twist and coil like snakes. I tried to keep my breathing steady, narrating softly to the camera to keep myself grounded, but my voice was shaking, betraying the fear clawing at my insides. The staircase felt like it was never going to end. Step after step, the darkness only got thicker, almost suffocating. I kept my hand on the railing, the rusted metal biting into my palm, just to make sure I wasn't completely swallowed by the blackness. My mind was racing, and every little noise, every drip of water, every groan of the old building, made me jump. The further I went, the more I noticed that the walls were covered in strange scratches and markings, like something had been dragged down here repeatedly. It wasn't just wear and tear, it looked deliberate, like someone, or something, had been carving its way out. Finally, the stairs leveled off, and I found myself standing in front of a heavy, reinforced door, the kind you'd see in a bunker or a vault. It was out of place, thick metal and rivets that didn't match the rest of the asylum's decaying wood and plaster. There were no handles, just deep scratches where someone, or several someones, had tried to pry it open. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something on the other side of the door, a faint movement or shadow that was gone before I could fully register it. My pulse quickened, but curiosity pushed me forward. I reached out, fingers trembling, and pressed against the cool metal. To my surprise, the door gave way, swinging open with a loud, grating noise that echoed up the stairwell behind me. The air that rushed out was even colder, carrying with it a stench that was almost unbearable, like old blood and wet stone, mixed with something chemical, something wrong. I gagged, but forced myself to step inside, camera still rolling. Beyond the door was a long, narrow corridor, lined with ancient brick that was slick with moisture. The ceiling was low, and I had to duck in places, feeling the rough texture of the bricks scrape against my shoulders. There were more of those strange symbols, etched deeper here, like they'd been burned or carved into the walls with something sharp. I ran my fingers over one, feeling the grooves, but I couldn't make any sense of them. They were jagged, almost violent, and they filled me with this gnawing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. As I moved forward, I started to see remnants of what must have been an old treatment area. There were rusted, overturned gurneys, their wheels locked in place as if they hadn't moved in decades. Broken syringes littered the floor, their needles bent and corroded, along with shattered glass vials and disintegrating straps. I stopped by an old chair that looked like it was used for electroshock therapy, its leather restraints still intact, stained dark with something that could have been rust, or worse. I couldn't help but imagine the things that had happened here, the desperate, panicked screams of patients trapped in their own bodies, doctors with cold, unfeeling eyes conducting experiments that no one would ever hear about. The place felt like a tomb, a graveyard for the asylum's darkest secrets, hidden away from the rest of the world. And now I was standing in the middle of it, surrounded by the echoes of things that should have stayed buried. Then, I noticed something at the far end of the corridor, a faint light, flickering like a dying bulb. I moved closer, each step slower than the last, until I could see what was casting the glow. It was a small, makeshift altar, crudely assembled from old medical equipment and debris. The light was coming from a half-melted candle, its flame weak and sputtering, like it was struggling to stay alive. Around it were offerings of sorts, old, yellowed photographs, rusted trinkets, and what looked like the bones of small animals, arranged in patterns that made my skin crawl. I picked up one of the photographs, my hand shaking. It was faded, the image barely visible, but I could make out a group of people, patients, maybe, standing in front of a building that looked like the asylum. They were smiling, but their eyes were hollow, empty, as if whatever was inside them had long since gone. I flipped the photo over and saw something scrawled on the back in smudged ink, for the price of peace. The words sent a chill down my spine. I set the photo back down and looked around, realizing that the walls were covered in more of those cryptic symbols, but this time, there were words too. Desperate, frantic pleas carved into the stone. Help us, it's hungry, and we are still here. Each message was more unhinged than the last, as if whoever wrote them had been driven mad by whatever they'd witnessed down here. The candle flickered again, and for a moment, it cast long, jagged shadows on the wall that seemed to move on their own, writhing and twisting like they were alive. My flashlight stuttered, and in that split second of darkness, I felt it, something cold brushing past my leg, just barely grazing my skin. I spun around, my light catching only empty space, but the feeling lingered, the sense that I was no longer alone. I tried to speak into the camera, to explain what I was seeing, but the words caught in my throat. The air was thick, pressing in from all sides, and every breath felt like inhaling ice. I backed away from the altar, the walls seeming to close in, and as I did, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, an opening, half hidden behind a fallen beam, just large enough to crawl through. It looked like a tunnel, dark and endless, and I had the sickening realization that this was where the asylum's secrets really lay. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but there was something in the tunnel, a faint, rhythmic sound like a heartbeat, drawing me closer. I crouched down, shining my light into the darkness, and caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the edge of the beam, a shape, shifting and pulsing, like it was alive. I pulled back, heart racing, and stumbled back into the corridor, the feeling of ice watching me growing stronger with every second. I knew then that I was in way over my head. This wasn't just an abandoned asylum, it was a place that had been feeding off the fear and pain of its inhabitants for decades, maybe longer. And now, it had its sights set on me. I had to get out, but as I turned to leave, the whispers started again, louder and clearer than before. They weren't just random noises anymore, they were voices, distinct and purposeful, and they were all saying the same thing. You shouldn't have come here. I don't know how long I'd been down there. My sense of time was all messed up, like the hours were slipping away without me noticing. The air was thicker now, like the whole place was alive and breathing around me, suffocating me with its weight. I tried retracing my steps back up the stairwell, but every turn felt wrong. It was as if the asylum was shifting on its own, twisting the hallways and staircases into some kind of trap designed to keep me inside. My flashlight was dying, its flicker more erratic, and every time it blinked out, I saw movement, quick, darting shadows that disappeared the second I tried to focus on them. The walls around me seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, almost like a heartbeat, and I could feel a low hum vibrating under my feet. I stopped in front of a corridor I didn't recognize, the bricks darker here, stained with something that looked like old blood. The whispers were back, no longer faint but loud, overlapping voices that filled the space around me. They were impossible to tune out, each one clawing at my sanity, pulling me deeper into the madness of this place. I pushed forward, my breath short and shallow, trying to find any familiar landmark, any sign that would lead me back to the main floor. But the more I walked, the more everything around me seemed to shift. The walls rippled as if they were made of liquid, bending and twisting with every step. Doors appeared where there hadn't been any before, and rooms stretched endlessly, their shapes distorted like reflections in a funhouse mirror. I stumbled into a large room, my flashlight struggling to cut through the dense fog that seemed to hang in the air. It was some kind of old therapy ward, rows of decrepit chairs and crumbling machinery arranged in a chaotic mess. But there was something wrong, something fundamentally off. The chairs were facing the walls, and in front of each one, there were mirrors, hundreds of them, cracked and covered in grime, reflecting the room from every possible angle. It was disorienting, like I'd walked into a labyrinth of glass, each reflection warping my image in ways that made my stomach churn. I turned slowly, catching glimpses of myself in the fractured mirrors. My reflection was distorted, my face stretched, eyes hollow and sunken, like the mirrors were showing some twisted version of me. I tried to look away, but the reflections moved on their own, turning to face me even when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was like they were alive, mocking my every move, and the whispers grew louder, echoing off the glass, multiplying with each reflection until it was a cacophony of voices all around me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. One of my reflections wasn't matching my movements. I froze, slowly turning to face it. The mirrored version of me was standing still, staring back with a vacant expression that sent a chill through my entire body. Its eyes were wrong, too dark, too empty, and as I watched, it slowly raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. The whispers turned to low, mocking laughter, and I realized with horror that whatever was on the other side of that mirror wasn't me. I backed away, heart pounding, but the room seemed to stretch, the walls pushing in closer, the mirrors multiplying until I was surrounded on all sides. Each reflection was different, twisted, broken versions of myself that moved out of sync, their eyes tracking my every move. They mouthed words I couldn't hear, their faces contorted into expressions of pain and anger, like they were trapped inside and begging to be let out. Panic set in. I turned and ran, crashing through the maze of mirrors, the glass shattering around me. Every piece that fell to the floor seemed to come alive, shards glimmering like eyes watching me from the ground. I could feel cuts forming on my skin, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I stumbled into another hallway, the air colder, and the ground felt uneven, almost as if I was walking on top of something soft and brittle. I shined my light down and immediately regretted it. Bones. Hundreds of bones, half buried in the dirt, crunching under my boots with every step. Some looked human, others animal, and all of them were tangled together in a grotesque display of death that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers were back, louder than ever, filling my ears with a chorus of pleading voices. "Turn back," they said, "you don't belong here." But it was too late. I was trapped, and the asylum was tightening its grip, reshaping itself to keep me inside. I stumbled forward, fighting the urge to scream, and found myself standing before another door, this one smaller, barely noticeable, hidden in the shadows. It was covered in deep scratches, like something had been trying to claw its way out. I hesitated, hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The metal was cold to the touch, almost biting, and I could feel a faint vibration coursing through it, like something on the other side was alive and waiting. I pushed the door open, and the air that hit me was thick with decay and rot. My flashlight flickered, casting a weak glow over what looked like a long-forgotten basement. The walls were lined with old, rusted pipes that groaned and hissed, dripping some unknown liquid onto the grimy floor. I moved cautiously, every step echoing louder than it should have in the confined space. The walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, smeared in a substance I didn't want to identify. They seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural light, almost like they were breathing in time with my own frantic heartbeat. At the far end of the room, there was a figure, a twisted, hunched shape that looked human but wrong, so deeply wrong that my mind struggled to make sense of it. It was standing in front of a wall covered in old photographs, hundreds of them pinned up with rusty nails. Each photo was of a different person, but they all shared the same vacant, dead-eyed stare. Some were black and white, others more recent, but they all looked like they'd been taken in the same room, under the same conditions. I recognized some of the faces. They were the missing patients, the ones who were never found. My stomach churned as I realized that these were trophies, collected over decades, maybe longer. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face half hidden behind a ragged mask. Its eyes were hollow, empty pits that seemed to drink in the light, and when it moved, I could hear the faint clinking of chains dragging on the ground. It pointed a bony finger toward the wall, and I followed its gesture, my eyes locking onto one photo in particular. My breath caught in my throat. It was me. The photo was old, the edges frayed, but there was no mistaking it. It was a picture of me, standing exactly where I was right now, my face twisted into a look of pure terror. I staggered back, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. The asylum wasn't just trapping people, it was stealing their lives, warping reality to make them a part of itself. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, just a strangled gasp as the figure lunged toward me, moving with a speed that was impossible. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me, but the whispers followed, echoing down the hallway, mocking me, telling me that I'd never leave. I bolted up the stairs, the building around me seeming to shift and twist with every step. I was running on pure fear now, every corner revealing a new horror, windows that showed reflections of things that weren't there, doors that led to rooms filled with nothing but darkness and the smell of death. The asylum was alive, and it was feeding off my terror, bending space and time to keep me trapped. I finally reached what I thought was the main hallway, the exit in sight, but the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall. I pounded on it, screaming, but there was no response, only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint, mocking laughter of the whispers. I was losing it, the asylum playing tricks on my mind, warping everything I thought was real. Every time I looked away, the walls seemed to shift, moving closer, like the whole building was closing in. I stumbled back, tripping over something soft, and landed hard on the floor. My flashlight rolled away, casting erratic shadows across the walls, and I could see them, dozens of figures, standing just out of reach, watching me. They were faint, barely visible, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hungry. They were the lost souls, the ones who never made it out, trapped here forever. And now, the asylum wanted me to join them. I crawled to my feet, my head spinning, and grabbed the flashlight, the beam flickering desperately. I ran down the hallway, not caring where it led, just trying to find a way out. The whispers were screaming now, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus that drowned out everything else. My vision blurred, the walls seeming to melt and warp around me, and I could feel the asylum pulling me in, dragging me deeper into its twisted reality. Just when I thought I was done, I spotted a faint glow at the end of the hall, a red, emergency exit sign, flickering weakly. I sprinted toward it, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, and slammed into the door, bursting out into the cold night air. I collapsed on the ground, gasping, my heart racing as the whispers finally faded into silence. I looked back at the asylum, its dark, looming shape silhouetted against the moonlit sky, and I knew that I had only just escaped. But the worst part? I can still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, just when I'm about to fall asleep. They're faint, almost imperceptible, but they're there, waiting. I staggered into the cold night air, but the asylum still loomed behind me, its dark, twisted silhouette etched against the pale moonlight. I could barely breathe, my lungs burning from the sprint, but I knew I couldn't stop. The whispers had faded, but their echoes still bounced around in my head, making it hard to think straight. My hands were shaking, and every part of me screamed to get away from this cursed place, but the path ahead was just as dark and uncertain as the hell I had left behind. I stumbled forward, using the faint glow of my flashlight, now barely more than a flicker, to guide me. The dirt road seemed longer than I remembered, winding endlessly into the woods like it was leading me away from any hope of safety. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see the asylum reaching out for me, but all I saw were trees, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes that clawed at the sky. The wind picked up, carrying a low, mournful howl that sent chills down my spine. It was like the forest itself was breathing, its sighs mingling with my own ragged gasps as I pushed on. I kept looking at my phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen was dead, a black void that reflected my own terrified face back at me. There was no GPS, no map, nothing to tell me how far I'd gone or how much farther I had to go. It was just me, the darkness, and the feeling that something was watching my every move. The further I got, the more the path seemed to twist, doubling back on itself in ways that didn't make sense. My footsteps felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud, and the air was getting colder, biting into my skin with every step. I could see my breath fogging up in front of me, and the chill seeped into my bones, making me shiver uncontrollably. It was as if the asylum's reach extended far beyond its walls, stretching out into the woods, pulling me back inch by inch. I saw a faint light flickering through the trees up ahead and felt a brief surge of hope. My car, I had parked it not too far from here, just down the road, and if I could make it back, I'd be out of this nightmare for good. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't coming from my car, it was coming from an old, rusted lamppost I didn't remember seeing before. It cast a sickly, yellow glow that barely caught through the thick darkness, illuminating the twisted branches above like skeletal fingers reaching down. I hesitated, staring at the lamppost, my mind racing. This wasn't right. I was sure I hadn't passed this on my way in. I moved closer, drawn by the faint light, and saw that the ground around it was littered with scraps of paper, old, yellowed pages that looked like they'd been torn from a notebook. I picked one up, my fingers trembling, and saw the familiar scribbles of a frantic hand. It was the same handwriting as the journal I'd found in the basement, the words scrawled in a mix of English and some other language I didn't recognize. My eyes scanned the page, and I felt my stomach drop. It was a message, hastily written, almost pleading, "Don't follow the lights. They're not real. None of this is real." I dropped the paper, my heart pounding in my chest, and took a step back. The light above me flickered, and in that brief second of darkness, I thought I saw movement, just a shadow, flitting between the trees, too fast to catch but close enough to feel. I spun around, shining my failing flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing there. Just the wind rustling through the leaves, whispering my name in a voice that wasn't quite my own. I started to back away, but the path behind me was gone. I was surrounded by thick, gnarled trees that seemed to have grown in an instant, closing me in like the walls of a cage. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, soft and unsteady, like it was trying to swallow me whole. I broke into a run, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. My flashlight was barely working now, casting more shadows than light, and every time it flickered, the world around me seemed to change. The trees blurred, twisting into monstrous shapes, and the path ahead split into a dozen different directions, each one looking more wrong than the last. It was like I was caught in a maze that was constantly reshaping itself, pushing me further and further away from any hope of escape. I turned down a narrow path, my heart hammering in my chest, and nearly tripped over something half buried in the dirt. I caught myself, shining the light down, and felt my blood run cold. It was another door, just like the one I'd seen in the asylum's basement, small, rusted, and covered in deep scratches. But this one was out here, in the middle of the forest, standing upright like it had been ripped from the asylum and placed here just for me. I didn't want to open it, but something compelled me to reach for the handle. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and a jolt of electricity shot through me, making my vision blur. I pulled back, but the door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The air that rushed out was thick and musty, carrying the unmistakable scent of rot and decay, and I could feel the whispers again, louder, closer, wrapping around me like tendrils, pulling me in. I tried to back away, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, tilting toward the open door. I dug my heels in, fighting against the pull, but it was like the whole world was tilting, drawing me toward the yawning blackness. My flashlight flickered out, plunging everything into darkness, and I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving inside the doorway. It was faint, a slow, shuffling noise, like something dragging itself across the floor, getting closer with every second. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, the impact echoing through the forest like a gunshot. I was on my knees, panting, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to make sense of what just happened. The lamppost flickered out, leaving me in almost total darkness, with only the faint light of the moon filtering through the canopy above. My eyes darted around, but the path was gone again, replaced by thick underbrush and trees that seemed to have grown impossibly close, their branches reaching down like arms, ready to grab me. I scrambled to my feet, tripping over roots and branches as I ran. The forest was alive now, its whispers turning into screams, each one urging me to turn back, to go deeper, to let it have me. My vision was blurring, and I could barely make out the shapes around me, but I could feel them, the figures moving in the dark, closing in, their eyes glinting faintly like animals ready to pounce. Then I saw it, a faint red glow, far off through the trees. It was the emergency exit sign, flickering weakly, but it was something, and I sprinted toward it with everything I had left. My legs were heavy, my muscles screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I reached the edge of the forest, bursting out onto the old, cracked pavement of the road, and there it was, my car, just where I'd left it. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat and blood, and practically threw myself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste a second. I floored it, the tires screeching as I tore down the road, putting as much distance between me and that cursed place as I could. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me, but the road behind was empty, just a long stretch of darkness that swallowed everything. But even as I sped away, I could still feel it, the asylum, the forest, all of it. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, a reminder that I had escaped, but not really. The whispers were quieter now, just faint echoes at the back of my mind, but they were still there, lingering, waiting. I knew I'd never truly be free of that place. It was part of me now, etched into my memories, following me wherever I went. I pulled over miles later, finally letting the adrenaline wear off as I sat there, staring blankly at the empty road ahead. I grabbed my camera, hoping to review the footage, but the screen was filled with nothing but static, warped, distorted images that flickered in and out, like the asylum itself had corrupted everything I'd recorded. But there, buried under the noise, I could hear it, the faint, unmistakable whispers, barely audible, but definitely there. I shut the camera off, tossing it into the back seat, and stared out at the darkness. I could still feel the asylum's pull, its presence lingering just out of sight, and I knew that it wasn't done with me. Not really. The whispers were a reminder, a warning that some doors, once opened, never really close. And no matter how far I ran, how fast I drove, I'd never be able to escape the asylum's reach. As I sat there, engine